Witam Państwa serdecznie, Błażej Hrabkowicz, festiwal EnergaCAMERIMAGE w Toruniu, 30. edycja. Our guest is cinematographer Ben Smithard. Hello.
Hello.
I want to talk to you, of course, about your work with Florian Zeller, which I think is really interesting. But before we get into that, I am also a big fan of Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon, and I watched The Trip and Alan Partridge. And this is the first thing I want to talk to you about because of the comedy as a genre.
Yes.
From your point of view as a cinematographer,
Yeah.
what is your approach to the comedy, and what was your approach to working on The Trip or Alan Partridge? Is this something that requires a different approach, or did you just use the tools you usually use? How was it?
Well, The Trip came first.
Yeah.
So that had to be a different approach because it had the crew to start with on The Trip had to be small because we were driving all around the north of England to these restaurants and these little pubs, and so it had to be small. Okay, so and also it wasn't scripted. The Trip was not a scripted drama or anything. It was totally unscripted. It was totally improvisational on the part of Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon. So I kind of knew from the word go that it would be like a documentary.
Oh,
and
really?
in a sense, it's not a documentary, but it is, because at the end of the day, they are doing something which is it's non-fiction. It's there's a certain level of reality to it, and that's what they're doing. So, but I knew my approach just had to be to shoot it like a documentary. And Michael Winterbottom kind of wanted that as well, because he wanted the director wanted the small crew. So. And we literally worked out the back of a small van, which is not what I'm generally used to, because I either shoot commercials or feature films, so it's usually a much bigger production. But I'd done that kind of thing before, so I needed to find a camera that was like a documentary camera in a sense, but it was obviously we were shooting on digital, we weren't shooting on film, and then so. That's how we and it was at the beginning of the little DSLR, so we shot some of it on that, like a 5D I think, or the 7D, I'm not sure, but that's literally when they were coming out. So it was at the beginning of digital. It was a few years after film was kind of losing its impact in the market, so I couldn't shoot it on film. So the whole thing was like a documentary.
Yeah, so when you say documentary approach,
Yeah.
You mean that you have to be more alert to what's going on, you have to choose equipment that allows you to react
Yes.
in a very, react fast?
Exactly, it had to be like that, because I knew that the thing was that I mean, it wasn't implicit that Michael Winterbottom didn't say this is exactly how we have to do it, but it just seemed obvious that's the way it was going to go. Because the thing is that when you're dealing with characters who are improvising, you just have to be quick to be able to capture everything, because you don't want to miss things. Because if you've got an improvised film, the structure is loose, so who knows what's going to happen? Yeah. Who knows what's going to happen? But how do you know what's going to fit? So you could, we shot some scenes, for example, where they'd be improvising at a bar or whatever, and it wasn't something that Michael had said, this is what we're going to do. But I'd see them doing it, and I'd go, let's just get the camera. So I got to a point very early on, within a day or two, I knew that I had to be able to do it. I mean, there was a lot of things set up on that, because it was all about these lunches that they were having in these various different restaurants. So they were set up because you knew that was going to happen. But everything around it was quite loose. So you had to treat it like you were shooting an observational documentary, because you don't want to get in their way. You don't want them to really know you're there, although that's kind of a trick that they just forget you're there because you don't make any fuss. You don't. And Michael said to me, "How would I light it?" And I said, "Well, I won't." So I didn't light any of The Trip at all. There's one scene where I had to, for one of the restaurant scenes, it was getting very gloomy, so I knew that I was going to have to. It was the only scene in the film that was lit. The rest of it was just all available, like the whole film.
That's very interesting because when I was thinking about talking to you about the trip, I would think that the main theme would be how approach to do a comedy. But from what you're telling is that the comedy was sort of on the part of Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon, and from your part and the director's part was to capture it as quickly as naturally as possible.
Yeah, it was about the camera not forcing what that story is, because if it's by its pure nature, you don't know what the story is until they start talking about
Sure.
it. They invent the story as you go along, pretty much, and then Michael would obviously work out what the structure is as it was going in his head, and then you as long as you could react quickly. There was a couple. I think on the very first day of shooting, we did one of the restaurant scenes of them having lunch together, and then I think it was in the countryside up in Yorkshire, in north of England, and then Michael said, "Oh, let's go up to this hill," and it was getting dark, so we all went up to this hill and took all the gear up there, and I didn't quite realise how cold it was going to be, because I didn't realise how long we were going to be up there. But I thought when I got there and started shooting, I thought I was going to die. I was so cold. We kind of lived together for 8 weeks. We all did. We all stayed in the same places. We all ate in the same restaurants, and so we kind of just lived together. I mean, I think the trip is a bit of an anomaly because nobody really knew what it was about, and nobody really knew whether people would like it. And obviously since then it's gone on to become pretty successful, and they've done 2 or 3 seasons. I just shot that 6-episode season. I think it's 6 episodes, and it's an amazing experience because I've always loved shooting documentaries, but I don't shoot that many. I shoot mostly fiction.
Feature films, yeah. And speaking about feature films and the work you did with Florian Zeller, which of course is, as opposed to the trip, scripted drama. When I watched The Father, the thing that really struck me was how it wasn't a realistic psychological drama from the objective point of view, but it was a story about a man with Alzheimer's disease, which is basically taking part in his brain, in his head. So what was what was your reaction to that idea? What was your sort of idea to do it, to approach it, because of this non-objective, thing that we are in his mind?
I think the thing is that I mean, through discussions with Florian, it's very obvious that the film is, to me, it was very obvious at the beginning, the film's about his fear, because that's the first thing that you see with him. It's about his fear because he has no idea what's going on, and he can't, all the normal kind of logical things we have as human beings, he was losing elements of his memory, and so it was never going to be a social exercise about what dementia is about. It's about this man's fear, and I kind of approached it in a very simple, dramatic fashion to start with, because I think the first scene in the film is pretty much one of the first scenes we shot, is when his daughter Olivia Colman comes back and sees him and starts talking to him about the way he's been treating his live-in carer, or his carer. And that's a very simple scene because it's just a confrontation between him and his daughter. But from that moment on, because I'd seen the performance, and obviously I'd worked with Anthony Hopkins, I think that was the 3rd time I'd worked with him. Anthony Hopkins, I'd worked with him twice before in 2 other films. So I knew that he was going to come in really well prepared. He just does his homework. So you don't need to he doesn't need to find that performance. He kind of just gives it to you. And then Florian needs to temper that performance to the story. And so then once I'd seen Hopkins portray this character, then I realised how I should shoot it. I mean, we had spent a lot of time in pre-production because I'd never worked with Florian before, and Florian hadn't directed before. So we spent a good maybe 3 weeks on that, just literally going through every word of the script, of his script, in very fine detail, every scene, and I drew every little scene out and we discussed it, and it took 3 weeks, just the two of us. So we knew what we were doing, but some of the details, the question you're asking is the detail about how I was going to film it. I didn't really get all of that information until I started to see Hopkins' performance, because then it made a bit more sense. But then it was. I just a lot of the time I tried to frame him on his own. Yeah, I was not over the shoulders, and the same the other way around. Or with him, maybe I use a little part of his body over his shoulder to his daughter. But I'd always try and isolate him, and then you just slowly get closer and closer and closer to him. And it's just, I mean, they're not really tricks, but they're methods to try and tell his story. Because the thing was that and Hopkins' performances sometimes is so subtle that you just have to make sure that I'm capturing that. So then, because trying to get this objective truth is very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult in any film, really.
Sure.
So it's always going to be a little bit subjective.
Pretty impossible, I guess.
Yeah. Pretty impossible, yeah. But you try. So you're always dealing with the subjective. So I knew that because I'm watching it, because I'm operating the camera, the audience won't be able to take their eyes off him because his performance was amazing.
Yeah.
So that was the key thing, you know.
Quite a different challenge in The Son, I guess, just to finish up our conversation, but I just want to talk to you also a bit about The Son. You also did it with Florian Zeller, but the premise is a bit different, and I guess the point of view, the perspective is also maybe a bit different. So mainly how was that different to you, the son compared to the father?
Okay. Well, the son, the big difference between the son and the father was pre-COVID when we shot it. Okay, so life was just completely different, and the son was like pretty in the depths of COVID. So that immediately affected everything we did. The crew didn't change in a sense; it was the same size crew, but it was hard. It was tough. It was much harder to shoot. I mean, and also Hugh Jackman as a lead works in a very different way to Anthony Hopkins. I mean, a fine, really good actor, very, very, very giving, supremely professional, and just really helpful, in a sense that performance was going to take longer for Hugh Jackman to get, I think, because Hopkins had just worked it out before he went anywhere near that film set, and. I had to treat them like different films, even though it's the same director, and the stories have a similarity, but they were 2 years apart, so I just went into it like a completely different film, and I didn't know how Florian wanted to prepare it, but ultimately we prepared the son in a very similar way that we prepared the father. It was just the methodical and detailed approach to looking at every single word, every single scene, and drawing the scenes out and discussing. And again, we took 2 or 3 weeks, but just the two of us talking through everything. So our relationship was by that time was becoming pretty intense because we knew each other really well then. But the approach had to be slightly different because it's with the son. It's whose eyes do you look at that film through?
Exactly.
Well, to Florian, it was a big question, and when I was reading, I thought, well, it's through the son's eyes, but the film's not really. It's through the father's eyes, because his story is his relationship with his ex-wife, his new wife, his son, obviously, and his own father. So it's a much broader story there. So really, the son is told through Hugh Jackman's eyes, in that sense.
Thank you very much, Ben, for talking with us.
Yeah, good questions.
Thank
Good
you.
questions. I hope the answers weren't so bad.
Yeah, well, they were great.
Really
Good to
good
have
questions.
you here.
I mean, you did your homework.
Thank you.
You're
Thank you
wel-
very much.
Oh, and then the Alan Partridge movie, I did that with Steve Coogan because at the end of the trip, Steve said to me, "I'm doing this film. Would you like to do it?" And that never, very rarely happens. So, you know, where an actor says, "Would you like to?" Obviously, I had to go and have a meeting with the director and get the film. But I did the Alan Partridge film because I'd just done the trip with Coogan, and I really liked working with him. And your question earlier on was how as a cinematographer, because that genre is pretty well defined generally, comedy. How do you? And you know, it's cinematography in comedy is difficult because you're not, you know, if you're in general normal fiction films, your importance is up there, but in comedy it's a little bit, it's like, you know, just make sure the audience can see the actors, you know. A lot of the time, you know, and there's no, it's weird because, you know, sometimes people question you and they go, you know, what have you got to show me to say you can do this? Maybe a commercial. And you know what the answer is, and because I've worked with some really quite successful comedy directors in commercials, and their answer to this is you can't shoot funny. You can't shoot funny. There's not a funny lens. There's not a lens that does funny. Do you see what? There just isn't. You can't do. It's funny if it's funny.
Exactly.
It's got to be. It comes from the contributors. It comes from the artists. It comes from the actors. Whatever. But you can't shoot funny. What are you going to do? Go handheld? Is that funny? Go on a. You know, I mean, the thing about comedy is, yeah, you kind of want to be a little bit looser, so you see a bit of body language and stuff, and it doesn't work so well in a big close-up. Yeah. But it's not to say you don't need the close-up, because you do. But you just need to. A lot of the time with comedy is be a little bit loose, and sometimes make sure that you've always got. If it's a two-hander, you've got the two people in the scene because it's got to really help. Yeah. But you can't shoot funny. Yeah. That's the bottom line is. But
you can make sure that the actor is visible, and I'm sure you did it very well. Thank you.
Well, yeah. In the trip, it was all. I didn't like any of it. The Alan Partridge movie was just lit like a conventional film, and you know, I mean, working with a master like Coogan is brilliant because he is a good actor, and he's funny, and he's good, and he's clever, and he's smart, and you know, so I was just really glad that I got to do the trip and the Alan Partridge movie film. Almost back to back, pretty much.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for being with us. Dziękujemy.